I felt this was also supported by Polanyi's idea about how we construct frameworks through which we extend our body out into the world, and also Ilyenkov's idea of artifacts, or social artifacts, which we use to negotiate our relationship with the social and the material world around us. Now, based on my exposure, perhaps 20 years ago, to some ideas from NLP and Ericksonian hypnosis, I'd become aware that I do spend a lot of time in what was called the second position, thinking about where others might be coming from and what they might be expecting of me. And at the same time, my experiences of what I called earlier in the thesis the systemic spiral had given me some skill in moving to what was called the third position, where I could look at the relationship between myself and others in different ways, and get a sense of what was going on in that relationship, and possibly also get some sense of the context in which that was taking place. So I think what this enabled me to do was to perhaps start in the first position, but thinking about the other, then moving to the third position to get a sense of the relationship, and then moving back into the first position to respond differently based on what I'd discovered from this little cyclic move. And of course it all happened in a moment, but when I was back in my first position, I was able to speak from my position with the other voices in my mind as well. And I think this helped me to take on this idea of becoming. Now, it was about this time that I started reviewing John Schotter's new version of his book Conversational Realities. I'd long been aware from my NLP training of this idea that it's the response to your communication that generates the meaning. But when I came across Barthes' idea of dialogically structured communication, I think this took me to a completely different level. You know, the idea that we're in our conversations we're anticipating and expecting certain responses from the other, which in a sense, as we offer these communications, they sort of go into a space between us where we lose unilateral control of what's going on, and we then have to wait for the response from the other, and to make some sense of that, to make some sense of what we've been doing. It reminds me very much of the saying that my old friend, systemic therapy friend Ros Draper used to say, which is wait for the feedback. And so it sort of brought in a whole new dynamic where I was communicating into this sort of pool of meaning, in a sense, between us, and I'd have to wait until I saw what came back to decide what it is that had been received by the other, so I could organize my response with that in mind. So I think when John Schotter talks about a third kind of knowing, which is what can come out of such a process, it just felt to me like it opened a whole new field of understanding where people in local situations could create a sense of meaning that made sense for them, and they didn't need to look to other authorities to decide what was real for them. So it took me a while for this to influence my thinking about ontology a little further, but I remember when I started reading about practice theory that I began to think that what I was doing with my friends and my colleagues when we were working in situations was I was constructing what Lepuma calls a divigil, not an individual but a divigil, who can perform effectively in a particular situation in an exchange with others. And in so doing, as I was working in all these different situations, I was building up experiences of being different kinds of individuals, and building up this range of experience, which in a sense was, when I stepped out of these local contexts, I could start to think of as making up my sense of self as an individual. And I found this a very useful way of trying to put together what I was doing in a situation, seen as a practice, not as me being the be-all and end-all, but then being able to come back and think about myself as the center, but based on what was really happening in situations. And I think this was further illumined by Alan Rainer's idea of inclusionality, which I came to perhaps rather late in the day, as another way of looking at what was going on in this flow of communication, embodied communication between people. And I got the sense of it was much more flowing and dynamic as we in a sense opened up the excluded middle. It now became an included middle in the flow that we could work with and shape up and create. But in a way, I think that comes later on in the thesis. But I think what I've offered in this little example is a framework which I now feel quite comfortable with. I can kind of hold it in my mind as I'm working with others, and sort of feel the impact of the flow one way and the flow back, and I'm sort of part of a kind of a dance. And it makes me think that it's helping me get a glimmer of what, well, to misquote Foucault, of what I did has done. I'm starting to get a sense of that. And I suppose also using Polanyi's idea about ontology, achieving a new fruitfulness in what I'm doing. So I think what I hope I've demonstrated in this piece is that from the primitive reaction I've moved into a much more sophisticated language game, which has offered me, again to use Wittgenstein's terms, a new form of life, which I've been able to connect to my own terms, fleeting moments, development episode, and assimilate the ideas of people like Bakhtin and Polanyi, and to put it all together into my praxis, if you like, through this rather extended indwelling process. But what it has done for me is it's allowed me to extend my being in the world into new territory which I wasn't really consciously aware of. And so I think just to finish this, what I'm realizing now is that as I become more convincing in enacting this embodied way of life, I'm projecting expectations and anticipations onto others into this gap between us. And I'm just beginning to think that perhaps this is part of the reason, this expectation of learning and being able to flow more, that is helping my students respond so strongly to what I offer, and in certain cases being able to transform themselves, I think, quite significantly over the period of the 2 years.